Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are strapping in for a deep dive into the very core of German idealism, focusing on a figure whose work is absolutely fundamental.
Hmm.
Yet he's often treated, a bit dismissively, sort of a waypoint on the philosophical map.
Hmm.
We're talking about Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and specifically his attempt to build the ultimate self-sufficient philosophical framework, the Wissenschaftslehre, the science of knowledge. The traditional historical framing often just reduces Fichte to a mere rung on the presumptive ladder from Kant to Hegel.
Right, just a stepping stone.
Exactly. But our sources are really unified on this. They insist that this reductive narrative is profoundly inaccurate. Our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. We want to move past that and see German idealism as a complex constellation of systems, projects, critiques, and proposals.
A whole ecosystem of thought.
Yes, and in this constellation, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre doesn't just play a role, it's seminal. Its influence is far broader, and its implications, well, they're far more radical than we usually appreciate.
Yeah. And the reason Fichte becomes that hinge, that pivotal figure, is because he took on the greatest unresolved tension Kant left behind. The entire structure of Fichte's system is dictated by his confrontation with the vexed Kantian concept of the thing in itself.
That concept being, of course, the idea of an external mind-independent reality. Reality as it is outside of our consciousness.
That's right. It is the concept of a true, objective existence, regardless of whether we perceive it or not. And this problem of knowing reality, of reconciling our subjective experience with an objective world, is ancient. I mean, you can trace this all the way back to Parmenides, who famously distinguished between the path of truth, which grasps what is, and the path of illusion, which is just our sensory experience. Kant's Transcendental idealism tried to resolve this by limiting knowledge to the realm of appearances or phenomena, while still acknowledging the existence of the thing in itself, the noumena, as the unknown cause of our sensations. The problem was, Kant's description was widely criticized for being really obscure. It basically left a philosophical void.
A ghost in the machine. A necessary but totally unknown thing that somehow affects us but is forever inaccessible.
Exactly. And that obscurity forced Kant's successors, including Fichte, into this profound dilemma. You either had to develop an epistemology that still claimed to refer to a mind-independent reality, even if only through appearances, or you had to restrict epistemology to just the empirical world, abandoning any possibility of knowing or even talking about the thing in itself. Fichte's genius and his radicalism lay in his belief that to construct a complete, consistent, and first system of freedom based solely on the activity of the self or the I, he had to resolve this tension definitively.
This sounds like Fichte really set out to be the ultimate Kantian, arguing that he was the only philosopher who truly understood the Transcendental project and was willing to follow it through to its logical conclusion.
Oh, he was utterly convinced of that. And he was determined to clear up what he saw as Kant's residual dogmatism. But Fichte is notoriously difficult to interpret precisely because, as our sources note, his view on the thing in itself wasn't consistent. It evolved, and he maintained these distinct modes of address. The exoteric and the esoteric were technical.
Okay, so let's start with the exoteric view, what he told the public and, popular audiences. It sounds like he adopted a position of just outright strident rejection.
He did. In his more public or popular writings, Fichte stridently rejects the concept of the thing in itself. He dismisses it as a mere dogmatic concept, produced by thought alone, a pure invention without any reality. This public, forceful rejection allowed him to claim he was purifying Kantianism. If the external source of sensation is just a concept we invented dogmatically, well, we don't need it. He sought to show that all existence could be explained solely through the thinking of the intellect, the idealist stance, without falling into that trap of postulating external objects that somehow act upon us.
So the public gets the clean, radical idealist who says the world is explained entirely by the self. But if he rejects it publicly, what's the crucial twist in his technical writings, like the first Wissenschaftslehre? Does he really truly eliminate it?
Not at all, and this is the interpretive pivot. He doesn't eliminate the external world, he reinterprets its role. He acknowledges that every philosophy, even his own, necessarily refers to objects outside experience. He has to allow for something outside the self.
Why?
Otherwise, the self would be absolute and indeterminate, and there would be nothing to explain the concrete, limited nature of our experience.
That sounds incredibly complicated. He acknowledges an external reality exists, but at the same time denies that it can be known. And crucially, he has to deny that it has any capacity to cause our perceptions. How does he even manage that?
By meticulously rereading Kant, Fichte argues that Kant himself avoided invoking an unknown world source that caused knowledge. Fichte claims Kant stated that knowledge all proceeds from an affection, but not affection by an object.
That is a subtle bud. Wow, that's a devastating philosophical move.
It is. If you admit affection, input, sensation, but deny that the cause of that sensation has ontological status as a fully formed determining object.
And you've sidestepped the whole trap.
Exactly. You've avoided what Fichte views as dogmatism, the Platonism of an unknowable world source that dictates our experience. Fichte preserves the input without granting the external world any independence or power.
So Fichtean epistemology is built on a very fine line. An external world must exist as a limiting factor, but it cannot be known. Knowledge is strictly limited to what is given in and known through experience, that is, within the bounds of the self's own cognitive structures.
And this structural requirement is captured by that famous passage in his system, which serves as the ultimate definition of reality. He says, the ultimate ground of all reality is an original interaction between the self and some other thing outside it, of which nothing more can be said, save that it must be utterly opposed to the self.
That phrase, utterly opposed to the self, is so powerful. It confirms the external otherness necessary for the self to define itself, but it strips that otherness of all knowable contents. It's like an essential metaphysical placeholder. It has to be there, but its existence is just deduced from the limits of the eye, not experienced directly.
Precisely. And this is why Fichte successfully secures the possibility of knowledge, but at the evident price of denying causality to the world in itself.
Because if it were causal.
If the thing in itself were able to cause our sensations, it would determine the structure and content of the eye's experience, and that would destroy the eye's absolute freedom and spontaneity. And that absolute freedom is the non-negotiable foundational pillar of the whole Wissenschaftslehre.
I understand the stakes now. If the external world is causal, the eye is determined, and Fichte's system of freedom just collapses into what he calls dogmatism. But why is he so invested in explaining all of consciousness through the eye? What's the larger task of philosophy he's trying to achieve?
The task, as he articulates it, is incredibly ambitious: to provide a complete explanation for all states of consciousness, especially those contents that are not a function of our free thinking or willing. We need to account for the empirical facts we encounter, the fact that you open your eyes and see a structured world, not a blank slate, without relying on external naturalistic causes. He is drawing a line in the sand between his transcendental epistemological idealism and naturalism, which he equates with dogmatism. The idealist explanation starts with the thinking, willing subject, the eye.
And why is that superior?
Because the eye can be shown to be present within consciousness. It is immediately evident. You know you are a thinking, willing subject.
That's a huge methodological advantage. The conscious self is the one thing we absolutely cannot doubt. The naturalist, meanwhile, posits the thing in itself, a mind-independent entity, which can never be equally evident. You can never truly get outside your own mind to verify that independent object.
And this leads to the metaphysical victory of Fichtean idealism. If the idealist explanation, which constructs the objective world out of the necessary limitations and activities of the eye, if that succeeds in explaining all the determinate features of experience, and the naturalistic attempt fails because it has to resort to unprovable external causes,
then positing those external objects just becomes an ill-founded ontological extravagance.
Exactly.
So if the eye, through its own inherent structure and necessary self-limitation, is sufficient to generate the entire experience world of time, space, and objects, then the external world as a source of being is just redundant. It's philosophically unnecessary. We have no reason to believe in it beyond the abstract deduction that something must be there to be utterly opposed to the self.
Exactly. Reality for Fichte is thereby affirmed to contain understanding and aspiring subjects, along with their acts and states. The Wissenschaftslehre provides the epistemological bedrock for this commitment that reality contains finite, rational beings. By showing that the idealist explanation is both necessary and sufficient, Fichte mandates that our ontology ought not to include any essentially unmental entities. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the Transcendental critique.
And this is why he felt justified in making that grand claim that his system was the first system of freedom. He was truly liberating humanity from the fetters of things in themselves, which, he correctly pointed out, even Kant failed to fully dispense with, because he kept that causal link to the noumenal world intact. Fichte cut the cord entirely. The scale of this project, to explain everything using nothing but the I's own activity, is just breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to write a good philosophy. He was trying to create the science of science as such. Which brings us to his absolute methodological ambition to build a perfect, self-grounded system, starting with the Grundsatz, the unconditioned first principle.
This systemic drive was inspired heavily by earlier thinkers like Reinhold, who sought to structure philosophy formally, almost like geometry. Fichte needed to expose the entire philosophical system in a series of deductively linked propositions, starting with a Grundsatz whose truth was beyond question. If this first principle held, and the subsequent inferences were formally correct, then the entire unity and truth of the system would be corroborated.
So, philosophy for Fichte is operating at a meta level. It's not just asking about the world, it's asking about the very conditions for science, for logic, for knowledge itself. It's metalogic metascience, aiming for unqualified cognitive objectivity.
And to demonstrate this, he has to show how philosophy transcends mere formal logic. He uses the fundamental principle of logic, the law of identity, A equals A.
Right, and formal logic treats AA as just a rule of inference. If A is, then A is. It's purely conditional. It offers no actual knowledge about whether A exists or why.
Fichte argues that philosophy must transform this into a statement of unconditional truth and existence. And the only thing that exists absolutely, unconditionally, and necessarily is the self, the I. So when A stands for the I, we move from the conditional, if I am, then I am, to the absolute act, the Tathandlung.
Tatung, that's a compound word, right? Like action, Handlung, and fact, or deed, tact. So the fact act.
Precisely. It is the original foundational act of self-positing. The I states, I am posited because I am posited because I have posited myself. I am because I am. This is the only possible, unconditional, ungrounded truth. It is the I creating itself through the very act of knowing itself.
It's the moment of pure, absolute certainty that provides the foundation for everything else.
Yeah.
It's unobservable, non-empirical, but logically necessary. But
Wait.
if this I is truly absolute, how can Fichte avoid the system just becoming indeterminate, just an undifferentiated mass of being?
Because the absolute I, in the very act of self-positing, cannot remain an infinite, unlimited entity. If it were unlimited, it couldn't be defined. To be a finite conscious subject, and the actual goal of the Wissenschaftslehre is to explain us, the I can act only in a certain specific manner, its activity must be limited.
And this is the logical necessity for the system to posit the not I.
Exactly.
This sounds like a philosophical imperative for limitation. Without a limit, the I is nothing distinguishable. The theoretical part of the system culminates in deducing representation, explaining how this unlimited foundational I encounters its necessary limits, or the not I. And this is the point where we introduce that famous oscillating faculty, the power of imagination, or the free Einbildungskraft.
The free Einbildungskraft is perhaps Fichte's most critical and complex creation. It is the faculty that mediates between the pure, infinite I and the finite image of reality, the object we perceive.
We've used the term oscillating machine before, and I think that analogy helps. It's constantly moving, trying to reconcile two things that are fundamentally irreconcilable.
That's a very good way to put it. The imagination is defined as an interplay of the self, in and with itself, and it results in a self-conflict. It seeks to unite the irreconcilable poles, the finite and the infinite, the object and the non-object. Think of it less like a machine and more like a perpetually moving pendulum, trying to find a stable center between two magnetic poles that repel it equally. The imagination attempts to grasp the infinite power of the I and express it in a finite form or representation. But the moment it represents the infinite as finite, it realizes its failure, posits the infinite outside that finite representation, and then immediately tries to entertain that infinite potential again under the form of finitude. This constant wavering between object and non-object is the very engine of representation.
And if that process is perpetually oscillating, how do we ever arrive at a stable, recognizable world? How does that chaotic dynamism become the structured reality we inhabit?
That's where the understanding comes in. The understanding is the faculty responsible for arresting this movement. Fichte defines it as the power whereby transiency is arrested, settled, as it were, or brought to a stand, and is thus rightly termed understanding.
So the understanding is essentially the imagination stabilized by reason, or reason operating on the finite forms brought forth by the imagination. It turns the oscillation into a fixed, definite conceptual image.
Yes, the understanding acts as a mere receptacle, receiving and fixing the images the imagination brings forth. This explains why we experience the world not as flux, but as structured reality. The mind, through these activities, forms an ideal image that helps correlate the real limitations, the not I, with the ideal striving nature of the I.
This intense focus on mechanism and method, not just what the principles are, but how they are generated, was, for Fichte, his greatest innovation. He believed his far more scrupulous and explicit attention to methodological issues was his most important advance upon Kant.
He was meticulous. He was aiming for a rigorous and perspicuous method where every single claim is determined by those preceding it. He called this logical ascent synthetic Aufsteigen. But this rigor immediately led him to confront the limits of his own system.
The unavoidable circle.
Right.
He admits that the analysis of the subjective consciousness requires the tools of that very same consciousness, making absolute, unqualified objectivity. Well, arguably unattainable.
Indeed. He concedes that the Wissenschaftslehre is not merely a rule, but it is at the same time the calculation. The cognitive rules needed to judge the system must be borrowed from the very thing being judged.
So even Fichte admits he's kind of stuck here.
He does. While he maintains that, ideally, the system is infallible, he admits that the failure to achieve that perfection lies in the human factor, the finite philosopher performing the act of reflection.
This is a crucial admission of finitude, even within the act of deducing the absolute. To better understand his rigorous approach, we should probably spend a moment on the specific synthetic methods he identified. It clarifies how he intended to construct this thing step by step.
He laid out 3 distinct synthetic methods, particularly in his later work, the Wissenschaftslehre Nova Methodo. The most complex and philosophically productive was the synthetic dialectical method.
And how does that differ from traditional dialectics?
Well, traditional dialectics often works by revealing internal contradictions. Fichte's synthetic dialectical method begins with an explicit contradiction, a vicious circularity, or an impasse, say, the total opposition between the I and the not I. It doesn't analyze the contradiction to find a middle ground. It actively seeks out a new, higher principle that resolves the conflict entirely. And crucially, this resolving principle is a priori. It cannot be analytically derived from the elements of the problem themselves. It's a new generative insight that extends our cognition, a synthetic a priori extension of cognition.
Can you give us a kind of conversational example of how that might work in Fichte's mind?
Okay, think about the tension between freedom and necessity. If the I is absolutely free, the world is chaotic. If the world is absolutely necessary or determined, then the I isn't free. A pure analytic attempt might just say, they contradict, so one must be true and the other false.
Right.
Fichte, using this method, says, no, this contradiction must be contained within a higher principle that posits both of them simultaneously. And he then introduces the power of imagination as that higher principle. The imagination is the faculty whose very essence is to oscillate between freedom, the positing I, and necessity, the posited not I. The imagination isn't derived from the problem, it is the a priori mechanism he invented to make the coexistence of freedom and necessity intelligible within the system of the I.
That makes the Wissenschaftslehre sound less like a descriptive philosophy and more like an ingenious engineering project, where principles are invented out of logical necessity to resolve contradictions.
It is philosophical engineering aiming for absolute necessity. The second method, radical abstraction, is what he uses at the very beginning, abstracting from everything possible to arrive at aete. And the third, starting in media res, in midstream, involves starting with a common description of consciousness and then using analysis to peel back the layers until the implicit contradictions become evident, forcing a return to the foundational principles.
It's clear this relentless focus on showing the internal necessity of the system pushed Fichte beyond pure theoretical deduction. System had to explain the actual world, which involves law and society.
Absolutely. This systemic ambition required a concrete connection between theory and the real world, which led to his political realism. He saw law, in the Grundlage des Naturrecht, as a necessary material mediator between theory and praxis. He was wary of what he called formulary philosophy, philosophy that separates subject and object and becomes empty, abstract, and incapable of engaging with reality. Fichte demanded that philosophy incide upon the world. The only way for the pure I to truly manifest its freedom is through interaction with others, which requires a system of law and right. This desire for the concrete, for the system to engage the real world of constraints, is what sets him on a path towards realpolitik, anticipating some of Hegel's later conclusions about the state.
So we know the absolute I must be limited to become a finite subject, and since Fichte can't use the Kantian thing in itself as an external cause for that limit, the limit of the non-I must be posited by the I itself as a logical necessity. But how does this abstract necessity of limitation actually manifest in our daily, concrete, subjective experience?
It manifests through the Anstoß, or the check. This is perhaps the most crucial concept linking the theoretical I to the practical I. The Anstoß is the original non-posited condition of finite subjectivity. It is the raw, immediate, felt limit or resistance to the I's freedom.
Okay, can we contrast this specifically with Kant's idea of affection? Kant's affection implied that an external object caused the sensation.
Fichte's Anstoß is different because it's passive reception without external causality. It is merely the feeling of resistance that prompts the I to action. Fichte had to invent a kind of passive state that was not caused by something external. The feeling is simply given.
Like what?
Like elementary sensations, sweet, red, cold, etc. When you touch a cold surface, the feeling of coldness is the Anstoß. It disrupts the pure flow of the I's activity. The I is active in positing that cold surface as an object opposed to itself, but the raw feeling of resistance, the coldness, is non-posited. It's neither fully interior as a mere idea, nor fully exterior as a Kantian Ding-an-sich. It is the original passive givenness that sets the stage for all self-consciousness.
So the I is both conditioned by the check and simultaneously conditions the check by interpreting it and positing it as an object. It's an original state of passivity that is codependent with pure activity. And this Anstoß provides the necessary otherness that makes self-consciousness possible, because consciousness requires something to resist against.
Exactly. Without resistance, the I is a perpetual motion machine in a vacuum. It does nothing. To act, it must encounter something that forces it to assert its freedom against a limit. But this abstract subject quickly runs into another problem. It needs to be situated.
Which means it needs a body. And Fichte's deduction of, the Grundlage des Naturesse, relies entirely on the I being an embodied or incarnated rational being.
The body, or the Leib, the living body, is the indispensable material mediator between pure, abstract freedom and empirical, limited nature. It is, as one source describes it, matter wrecked with freedom. It's the meeting point. Fichte even resolved the traditional mind-body dualism by concluding that body and soul were one entity which may be considered from two different perspectives, external intuition and internal intuition. The body is necessary because it allows the I's free actions, originated through non-mechanical causality, willing to impact the world of objects. The body becomes the primary sphere of the I's rights.
And once the I is embodied, it necessarily confronts other embodied free rational beings. This is the transition to intersubjectivity, framed by the Aufforderung, the summons.
The Aufforderung is the mechanism through which the I finally constitutes itself as a particular subject. When you act freely, you eventually encounter another being whose actions are not predictable, who asserts themselves as an end, and who resists being used merely as your means. This encounter forces you, the initial I, to infer that the other being is also a free, rational agent because their resistance can be explained only by referring to a free acting outside of me.
It's the recognition that the other has the same internal source of freedom that you possess. So this is the intersubjective requirement for subjectivity itself.
And Fichte frames this in radical communal terms. He says, man becomes man only among men. An individual human being is unthinkable, but rather the concept of a species. The initial summons to recognize the other's freedom and thus limit one's own is the very basis of human upbringing, or Erziehung. You are literally educated into your freedom through the demands of others.
This emphasis on mutual recognition sounds very stable and, noble. But you mentioned earlier that critics, like Seep and Williams, point out that Fichte's theory of right immediately becomes unstable once he introduces the concept of certainty.
That's the crux of the critique. The whole system of right depends on mutual respect and recognition. However, how can I, the finite subject, be certain that you, the other finite subject, will perpetually respect my rights and restrict your freedom? Certainty is impossible in this intersubjective realm. This uncertainty leads to fragility, which Fichte immediately perceives as a fatal systemic weakness.
And that fragility triggers the transformation, the famous shift from the law of right, Rechtsgesetz, grounded in mutual recognition, to the law of coercion, Zwangsgesetz.
Precisely. Fichte is highly pragmatic here. He realizes that a system based on ideal mutual trust is non-viable in the real world. So the law must transform into the law of coercion, grounded not in recognition, but in the premise of universal egoism, the assumption that humans, left to their own devices, will likely transgress. The concern shifts from defining freedom to ensuring security, protecting property, and deterring transgression. And this move towards guaranteeing order and security leads Fichte to sanction what critics see as excessively intrusive authority for the state, neglecting the proto-communal foundation he so carefully established through the Erforderung.
So the critique is that Fichte, in his systemic ambition, is too quick to delegate the maintenance of freedom to a coercive state apparatus, bypassing the much messier but philosophically richer foundation of genuine human recognition.
Absolutely. And this structural instability brings to light the implicit master-slave dialectic embedded in Fichte's system, predating Hegel's articulation of the conflict. The dynamic centers on the summons and its corrupted counterpart, the anti-summons.
If the summons pulls one into existence as a human being by recognizing their freedom, then the anti-summons must be the attempt to deny that freedom entirely.
The anti-summons is the demand that the other limit their freedom indefinitely, thereby transforming the human being into an object for use, a resource, such as in cases of slavery or exploitation. The slave master attempts to systematically erase the slave's humanity. But here is the profound insight that Fichte touches upon and that Hegel later develops. The master is caught in a profound performative contradiction. To successfully keep a human being in bondage, to deny their status as a subject, the master has to first implicitly recognize that they are dealing with a human being.
Meaning, he has to first recognize the humanity of the slave if he is to deny the humanity of the slave.
Right. You don't need a system of control to deny the freedom of a rock. You only need the system because the object of control is a striving free agent. Exactly. The human being is not a passive object waiting to be enslaved. The process of making a slave requires work and practice. It requires the perpetual application of the anti-summons. Fichte, seeing this potential conflict as threatening the immediate stability of his system of right, moves too rapidly to the solution. Coercion, enforced by the state, designed to prevent the master-slave relationship from fully developing.
That seems like an inherently pragmatic failure for a transcendental idealist. If the conflict is constitutive of humanity, doesn't Fichte forfeit his transcendental claim by rushing to a political solution coercion before fully exploring the raw existence of the conflict?
He essentially closes the gap too quickly. He's so focused on creating the Grundsatz, the unconditioned system, that he cannot tolerate the fundamental, unresolved historical conflict within it. The consequence, as critics note, is a shared flaw affecting both Fichte and Hegel, though it's more pronounced in Fichte's early emphasis on coercion. They are perhaps too optimistic that the state is the reliable agent of reconciliation and the restorer of rights. They largely ignore the possibility, all too real in history, that the state itself is the agent of the anti-summons, the very oppressive force that prohibits true community and uses its authority to sanction the erasure of rights for marginalized groups. If self-certainty is achieved through mutual recognition within a privileged community, the state, as its instrument, may simply treat outsiders as non-persons.
Which proves that even a system as radically transcendental as Fichte's cannot ultimately be divorced from the realities of power, history, and empirical human behavior. The constraints of the real world, including political and social reality, constantly threaten to undermine the purity of the absolute I. Okay, so moving beyond the issue of right, Fichte's relentless quest for unity and his unique methodology made him a profound influence on his contemporaries, particularly in how they grappled with Kantian concepts. Let's start with those famous paradoxes, Kant's antinomies.
The antinomies, the insoluble conflicts of pure reason-like mechanism versus purposiveness, or freedom versus necessity, were a defining challenge for post-Kantian thinkers. Hölderlin, for one, recognized that Fichte had a remarkable idea regarding them.
Kant's solution was essentially to say that these conflicting principles coexist, but they apply to different realms, the phenomenal versus the noumenal. You could judge an event through mechanism or purposiveness, but you couldn't really solve the conflict itself.
Fichte radicalized this. He internalized the conflict. He showed the close interconnection of freedom and necessity by grounding them in the very construction of the power of imagination. For Fichte, the conflict isn't an unsolvable paradox external to the subject. It's a structural necessity of the I's self-activity. The conflict becomes a mere question of directing reflection on the one side, unfree not means, or the other, free end, of what the imagination is constantly holding together. The subject determines, spontaneously and freely, to reflect upon itself as determined, the not I side, or as determining the I side. The two sides are simply two perspectives on one unitary activity.
So the subjective experience of conflict, therefore, is simply an artifact of reflection, not a flaw in reality itself. This tension between striving and being limited also shapes Fichte's aesthetics, offering a really distinct contrast with Kant's approach to beauty.
Right. Kant focused on the form of beauty independent of determined concepts, believing that form refines color. Fichte, because his entire system is fundamentally practical, geared toward the I, striving to overcome its limits, connects the feeling of beauty directly to the spontaneous activity of striving, seeing it as a liberation from theoretical limitation. The feeling of the agreeable, the pleasure of beauty, the feeling of the sublime, and the will itself are all different stages of this self-striving's liberation from the strict theoretical constraints of the not I. Beauty is tied to the felt awareness of the I's infinite potential being temporarily beautifully arrested in a finite form.
This emphasis on potential and perfectibility brings us to a fascinating conflict with a contemporary critic, Wilhelm von Humboldt, on the essential vocation of man. Fichte and Humboldt both prioritized Bildung, or self-formation, but their ultimate goals were, well, diametrically opposed.
Fichte articulated his ideal in his lectures on the vocation of the scholar. For him, the individual has value only insofar as they contribute to the ultimate goal of the species. The ideal state is one where, if all men were perfect, they would be totally equal, one single subject. The individual must model their singular empirical I on the pure, identical I shared by all rational beings. The goal is convergence, unity, and oneness.
And since the individual is finite and subject to nature, perfectibility requires specialization.
Precisely. Nature affects the mind one-sidedly, producing individual gifts and particularities. Therefore, humanity can only realize its full dispositions through specialization and division of labor. Each individual develops her natural gifts unilaterally, becoming a perfect gear in the machine, and only participates in the totality of culture when she receives the results of others' particular talents.
And Humboldt took the absolute liberal counterpoint. He saw this as just sacrificing the individual for the abstract idea of the species.
For Humboldt, Bildung was aimed at the individual's highest and most harmonious development of his powers to a complete and consistent whole. The individual must not put aside aspects of personality or specialize unilaterally. They must integrate all their powers into a rich totality. To use your earlier analogy, Fichte's ideal subject is like a perfect, highly specialized gear in the machine of humanity, essential but incomplete. Humboldt, however, insisted that the ideal person must be the entire machine unto themselves, fully integrated, balanced, and striving for internal harmony. This philosophical gap was so stark that it directly fueled Humboldt's rejection of Fichte's proposed hierarchical organization for the University of Berlin.
Fichte's dominance in Jena was so profound that it naturally inspired an immediate and creative backlash, particularly from the early Romantics, Novalis and Schlegel. They embraced his idealism, but rejected his rigid foundationalism.
Their romantic critique centered on Fichte's methodological hubris, his attempt to construct philosophy from a single, fixed, unconditioned principle. Schlegel claimed Fichte tried and failed to completely forget all that has been thought before, mirroring Descartes.
So they saw his highly determined step-by-step deduction as rigid and dogmatic, a kind of philosophical dictatorship.
Schlegel mockingly likened Fichte to the Pope for arbitrarily positing the absolute foundation. He found Fichte's system too mathematical and insufficiently historical. Schlegel insisted philosophy must begin in media res, in the middle of things, by acknowledging and utilizing the entirety of the philosophical tradition, rather than trying to build a new system from scratch.
And Novalis, translating Fichte's core concepts of freedom and infinite self-activity, arrived at a kind of paradox.
Novalis realized that since the absolute is, by definition, unattainable, the I is perpetually engaged in an unending free activity. The simple fact of being I is a continuous process of change and transaction, operating through endless, never-satisfied striving. So Novalis coined the paradox that an authentic philosophical system must be about systematizing systemlessness. The system has to capture the dynamism and flux, not fix the principle.
And that inability to capture the absolute, that recognition of perpetual flux, leads directly to Schlegel's principle of irony.
Irony, for Schlegel, ceased to be a rhetorical device and became a philosophical principle, a permanent parabase or an oscillation between. Irony is the intellectual posture that drops Fichte's demand for logical consistency and coherence. It views knowledge as experimental. Irony embodies dialectical thinking of differences, refusing to fix truth or meaning. It insists on the movement between self-creation and self-destruction, between the I and the not I, never allowing the philosophical process to conclude, thus deconstructing Fichte's claim to a complete, highly determined system.
Fichte's insistence that the absolute was a unitary I consciousness also put him immediately at odds with the other great idealists who were developing their own systems, like Schelling and Hölderlin.
Schelling initially built upon Fichte, but quickly rejected his subjective monism. For both Schelling and Hölderlin, the concept of the absolute I was logically flawed because all consciousness is essentially intentional in structure. Consciousness, by its very nature, requires an object.
And if the absolute I is truly absolute, it must encompass everything and thus cannot have an object outside of itself.
If the absolute I had an object, it would cease to be absolute and unconditioned. Therefore, they concluded, consciousness directed at oneself cannot occur within the unitary absolute. Schelling concluded that the absolute is not wholly subjective and cannot be described as an I. It is an absolute non-subjective, a principle of identity that precedes the split between subject and object. Hölderlin went further, describing the absolute as being proper, sein schlechten, a unity that transcends all possible divisions we can conceive.
So despite the immediate and forceful rejection of Fichte's foundationalism by the Romantics and his system's monism by Schelling, his work is still essential for understanding later continental philosophy.
Absolutely. The enduring legacy lies not in his success at creating a perfect, closed system, but in the specific nature of his failure. What Hegel later criticized Fichte's systematic account of a fractured self constrained by an irreducible limit, the Anstoß actually foreshadows the Nietzschean and post-Nietzschean dissatisfaction with rational idealism. Fichte's realization that the I's foundational moment is disrupted by a limit that resists full rational incorporation, and his emphasis on the non-rational element of feeling at the heart of consciousness, became a historical touchstone.
So we see this influence in the 20th century then, in philosophy's focus on the passivity or givenness of the subject.
Precisely. Think of Husserl's concept of the non-intentional consciousness of the ego, Heidegger's facticity, the feeling of being thrown into a world that the self did not posit or choose, or Levinas's idea that true subjectivity is inaugurated with an extreme passivity in the face of the unassimilable other. Fichte's final conclusion, that his system could only be a systematic account of a fractured self, makes him intensely relevant as a precursor to thinking about constitutive self-alienation and the limits of purely rational freedom.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Fichte's entire philosophical life was dedicated to the search for absolute unity, to ground all knowledge and existence in the absolute, self-positing I, thereby establishing a true system of freedom, free from the fetters of things in themselves. But as we've explored in depth today, that quest for self-determined freedom immediately ran into necessary structural limitations. The non-causal Anstoß, the embodied Leib, the intersubjective Aufforderung, and the necessity of state coercion. His perfect self-grounded system ultimately became, in its practical consequences, a system of necessary disunity.
So, what does this all mean for us? Fichte's lasting significance lies not in the claim that he achieved the goal of the absolute system, but in the rigor and unflinching detail of his attempt. He bequeathed to subsequent philosophy the necessity of integrating the practical, the non-rational feeling and passivity, and the intersubjective other into the very core definition of the self. He showed that you cannot define the I in isolation. Fichte claimed his was the first system of freedom, yet his work reveals that freedom is not an isolated, achieved attribute of the self-positing I. It is a constantly contested status, an ought that remains dependent on an external check, Anstoß, and an internal summons, Aufforderung, to moral action and recognition. Given the essential circularity of reflection and the inherent resistance he identified, the fact that the subject must strive perpetually to achieve an impossible perfect rationality is the ultimate freedom in Fichte's philosophy, found not in the final, perfect, closed system, but in the existential, experimental, and endless task of building it, knowing it can never be finished.